Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from Scotland and the rest of the UK. Good evening to you in India, and welcome to this event from the Asia Scotland Institute. My name is Martin Perbrick, I'm the Institute Director, and our focus today is a discussion for the future of Indian business. Obviously extremely wide subjects, will be coming at quite a high level, I think. We have two guests today who I think I would call them veterans, if that's not an impolite word to both of you. I mean in the nicest way. Firstly, Mr. Vikram Singh Mehta, a veteran Indian business executive, former chairman of Shell India, and I think I would say a thought leader in India, certainly for business and society. And also Mr. Richard Heald, who's the chair of the UK-India Business Council and the former vice chairman of Rothschild for South and Southeast Asia. So both with deep insight into India. If I could just explain a little bit more about their background, if they'll both excuse me for talking about them. Vikram was executive chairman of Brookings India and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, which after a change of name of that institution became the Centre for Social and Economic Progress in India, that is, which is a think tank that conducts in-depth policy relevant research and provides evidence-based recommendations on the challenges facing India and indeed the world. Vikram has an illustrious career. He started with government, which I'm glad to see, as did I, with the Indian Administrative Service in 1978. Later joined Phillips Petroleum in London as a senior economist, and then in due course returned to India to join Oil India Limited. I believe Vikram joined Shell International in London in 1988 and was managing director of Shell Markets and Shell Chemical Companies in Egypt in 1991, and then chairman of Shell Group of Companies in India in 1994. Left in around 2012, I think, moving on to take up the role of executive chairman of Brookings India and being a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution at the same time. He's now the board member of a long list of companies, which you can see on the website of the Centre for Social and Economic Progress, I think. He has a BA Maths honours degree from St Stephen's College, Delhi University, and a BA MA Economic honours degree from Magdalen College, Oxford, and a postgrad degree in Energy Economics from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University. Lastly, if not least, I may say, Vikram is a member of the Asia Scotland Institute International Advisory Council. So thank you very much for that, Vikram. Also, Richard Heald, who very kindly has agreed to join this discussion at short notice. Richard joined the UK-India Business Council as its CEO in September 2010, and then recently became the chair of that organisation. And if I just explain what the UK-India Business Council is, perhaps to allow him to not have to explain. It's an entity that provides export services to small and medium-sized companies, offices in Mumbai, Bangalore, Gurgaon, as well as regional representation across the UK. The Council also provides sector-focused policy advocacy and consultancy to members and major corporates in areas such as infrastructure, digital economy, healthcare, learning, advanced manufacturing, and defence. And most interestingly, I think, the Council acts as the secretariat for the UK Prime Minister for the UK-India CEO Forum and for the UK government in the Joint Economic Trade Committee. So again, deep insight into India. And in addition, Richard has worked for a lengthy period for Rothschild, being vice chairman previously of Rothschild South and Southeast Asia, and has long experience dealing with capital raising, secondary capital raising in financial markets. Can I just remind attendees today, we're on the Zoom webinar platform, so your videos and your microphones are disabled for the webinar. If we do have some questions later in the webinar, we would like to come to you, so please could you put questions in the Zoom chat function, either privately to me or to the group if you wish, and we'll take a note of them and come to them after the initial discussion. So with that, could I please hand over to Roddy Gow, Chairman and Founder of the Asia Scotland Institute, to start the discussion, please. Over to you, Roddy.
Martin, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to both Vikram and Richard for participating in this event. I'm grateful to both of you, particularly grateful to Richard for coming in at pretty short notice, because Nazneen Kamali, sadly, is having to look after her mother, who was admitted to hospital on an urgent case yesterday. So we wish her well, but she's not with us, and Richard is not Nazneen, in case anybody was confused for a moment. I'd like to start off, Vikram, by asking you if you could talk to us a little bit about how you view overall developments in India from the outside, particularly now that Trump has gone and we have Biden in the United States, where I'm ringing in from, and with the Boris Johnson meeting coming up. People try to figure out what Mr. Modi is all about. I mean, is he a nationalist? Is he ruling in an increasingly autocratic manner? Are there issues within society in a post-COVID environment that are going to impact or are impacting business? So I suppose my question is, for people running businesses in India, whether they be Indian or whether they be international in India, how does the world look going forward? And could you give us some guidelines for that? Thank you.
Well, firstly, thank you, Roddy. Thank you, Martin, for inviting me back. It's always a pleasure to be with the Asia Scotland Institute, and I'm grateful for this invitation. Your question, of course, is related to a subject that's vast, and it cannot be responded to without placing the Indian economy in context, and within the Indian economy, the challenges that face our industry. So let me take about maybe 10 minutes or so, if I may, to provide you with an overview of the economy, the drivers behind industrial policy, the drivers that are pushing the government in a particular direction, and then the challenges that industry faces. And that should, I think, hopefully answer the questions that you have raised as to what is the future, what is the outlook for Indian industry. I will have to be very succinct in my remarks because clearly time is limited and the subject, as I say, is vast. So just a quick backdrop. Of course, last year has been an extraordinary year. Today, indeed, is the anniversary of the formal lockdown in India. The day that Prime Minister Modi locked down the entire country, and that, as you will appreciate, knocked the props from under the economy. 100 million casual workers found themselves on the road back to their villages. One estimate had that 125 million people lost their jobs. And of course, the economy went into a tailspin. Growth was in negative territory. Now, over the year, the economy and industry in particular have actually come back onto the rails in a pretty impressive way. The recovery has been driven largely by public investment. The other three drivers of growth, private investment, exports, and domestic consumption, have not really been as supportive of growth as the government. The government pumped in a lot of money over the course of the previous 12 months, and that helped in the third and fourth quarter of our fiscal year. It's helped release pent-up demand. So the combination of public investment and, to an extent, the release of pent-up demand has pushed the economy onto positive growth. But private investment and exports, the other two, we might say, drivers of growth, remain laggard. The other feature of last year that must be emphasized is the role of the state. The state played a very important role in managing the COVID crisis. The market in itself could not have done it, and that's become very clear. And what's also come through in the course of the past 12 months is the fact that the developmental model that best suits our economy is a collaborative developmental model, one that brings government, the private sector, and civic society together. COVID was best handled in those parts of India where these three entities really worked hand in hand, hand in glove. The other, I think, important point to note is the role, or the response of industry, and this response actually threw up a K-shaped recovery. The large cap companies and companies in the IT sector, they were very successful in re-engineering, in deleveraging, in building up their costs, in cutting costs, and in transforming their business model towards an online digitized model. And their market cap really went from X to 5X, no, that may be an exaggeration, X to 2 to 3X over the course of the last 12 months. The small and medium scale industry and the service sector remain in deep trouble. And the small and medium scale industry accounts for 60% of the people employed. And so there is still a major scarring of the labor market. Today, even the growth is pushing on, and even though many companies are seeing a surge in revenues and profitability, there are at least 10 million people who do not have jobs relative to the numbers that we saw pre-COVID. There's also a social consequence of all of this, of course. The COVID has further exacerbated the disparities in our society. And the women in particular have been badly impacted. The participation rate of women has fallen sharply. I should also add that we face geopolitical tensions that were unexpected. The border issue with Pakistan has been unresolved for years, but tension on the border did worsen. And the most dramatic development last year was, of course, the clash on the border with China. And that led to certain decisions, which I'll come back to later on. And finally, I think as a backdrop to all discussions on our economy and on industrial policy, we have to take into account the fact that India is almost continually in an election mode, with one central government and 28 state governments. There's at least 1, 2, or 3 states that are go into elections every year. So next month we have the state of Bengal, Assam, Tamil Nadu, and one other smaller state facing an election. This means that our political leaders, whether they're at the center or in the states, are compelled to navigate the challenges of politics and economics. And that happens almost on a continual basis. So against that backdrop, what are the drivers that determine policy today, economic policy, industrial policy? I think the first very important driver that we should acknowledge is the fact that Prime Minister Modi is a pragmatic politician who understands the economy probably better than anyone else in his cabinet. And he has initiated a number of reforms in his second term that he was expected to actually initiate in the first term, but did not do so. For example, the labor code, which is very complex, has been simplified. He has, in the latest budget, announced that many of the public sector enterprises will be disinvested. And in fact, he's introduced the word privatization. It might not be something that your listeners will appreciate, but for the last 20 years, we've talked about disinvesting government shares from the public sector, but we hesitated to use the word privatizing the public sector. Well, today this time around, we're now talking about privatizing the state public sector, which is a very important and it's not a semantic change, it's an important signal. He's introduced the bankruptcy law, and there are many other laws that have gone, which establish, I think, without any question, the intent of this government to bring in some of the reforms that were delayed or were not implemented in the first term. The second driver, is the fact that we are facing macroeconomic pressures. The fiscal deficit is going to be over 10% of GDP. And the only way that this can be financed in the coming years is going to be by monetizing the government assets, whether it's the public sector disinvestment, whether it's land, whether it's land held by the railways or the defense sector. But this is a significant shift now, and it's driven by the fiscal pressures that the government faces. A third driver of change is the fact that we are a federal structure, of course, and states are in a competitive mode against each other. And we should also note the fact that state governments control many of the factors of production: land, labor, electricity, water. These fall under the umbrella of the state, and no company can function unless they have taken into account the policy of the state. The policy of the central government, is only a necessary requirement, but in order to actually establish a holistic approach to investment policy, you have to understand what individual states are up to. The government is also driven by a policy that calls for both self-reliance and at the same time in integration with the global supply chains. And that's another driver behind the sort of policies governments implemented in recent months. And the final driver, and well, there are many, but the final important one is, of course, politics more often than not trumps economics. And to that extent, the subsidy regime remains, and it's a major drain on the exchequer. So there are subsidies on fertilizers, the subsidies on food, the subsidies on power, and they're distortionary, but they're not going to be removed in the near term. Now, if you were to, against that backdrop and with this driver, if I was to just summarize some of the key policy components of India's current industrial policy, I'd put it in, let's say, broadly speaking, five sort of buckets. First is that the intent to reform is now very clearly established, and the intent here is to encourage private investment, upgrade and to spend money to upgrade the infrastructure. And in a way, it is also an intent to shed the past, well, you might say, verities, the shibboleths that govern past policy. Banks, for example, were nationalized by Mr. Indira Gandhi, and there's been no denationalization of banks since 1969. But this budget announced the privatization of at least 2 banks. So it's a reform direction. The direction of change is towards reform. The second broad component of policy is the determination to increase the share of manufacturing in our GDP from around 17% today to 25%, and to create global manufacturing hubs. Now, they're going to do that through a combination of measures, but one significant incentive that's been offered companies is what is called production-linked incentive. And government is offering in the industry between 4 to 6% of production as an incentive if they achieve a certain minimum of investment and capacity. There are 13 industrial sectors that have been identified to benefit from this PLI or this incentive. and the logic behind that selection was really companies that were able to produce jobs and that could be competitive against the export market. The third component of policy is to really reinvigorate credit. One of the big challenges that we have faced, not just during the last year, but over the last two and a half years, is the fact that the banks, and the public sector banks in particular, were loaded with non-performing assets, as a consequence of which the credit flows, fund flows into industry dried up. And this has, of course, impacted private investment in particular. So there's a huge effort now to recapitalize these public sector banks, to reinvigorate credit, to create an asset reconstruction sort of company that will take all the companies that are bankrupt and somehow or the other, either revitalize them or liquidate them. So that's a third part of it. Another very important direction that, again, is important for businesses, and especially those in the UK, is now the acceptance that insurance companies can be held, that foreign companies can come in and hold a majority shareholding in insurance. Until its last budget, that was not the case. And finally, the government is talking about innovation in a very aggressive way, because they want to decouple and from China in particular, and part of the logic and the part of the roadmap, you might say, for achieving that decoupling would be if they can create their own technologies for electronics, for clean energy, and for pharma, and these are the three sort of broad sectors that depend heavily on imports from China. And we need, and that cannot happen. We cannot decouple supply chain unless there's a lot of effort in creating our own domestic indigenous components for these sectors. Now, finally, there are many questions, and then we can talk about that. I mean, this is the direction of policy, but the challenges, the questions, the issues remain. I mean, the macro environment is a big uncertainty. I mean, we, as I say, face a huge fiscal deficit. We have to finance it. But there are going to be pressures on inflation. There's going to be, there's going to be pressures coming from the international community. Raw material costs, both domestic and international, are going up. Oil prices have gone up. So that's on a macro scale, all industry faces this challenge. There is always the question about implementation. The intent has been clear. The intent is clear. But one of the problems that India has always faced, not just this government, the previous governments, is to bridge the gap between intent and implementation. And that, unfortunately, remains an uncertainty. The incentive structures that the government has chosen at one level, of course, are very encouraging, but I can see a challenge in implementing the PLI, for example. We are choosing winners. We are saying there are these 13 sectors, and within those 13 sectors, these are the companies that should be entitled to the production-linked incentives. If we are unsuccessful, or if we get our winner, if we get the choice of winners is wrong, then there will be a misallocation of resources. And I make this point only because in the 1990s, I don't think there were many economists or policy wonks prepared to actually identify IT or auto components or pharma as sectors that are going to lead the economic recovery. But those are the very three sectors that did. So there is a challenge here on ensuring that we do not choose winners that result in a misallocation of resources. The factor markets, these really do need to be rationalized. What do I mean here? Land, labor, capital markets, electricity cost. Again, the intent is there, but it is very difficult to acquire land. It's very difficult still to get rid of labor, and the cost of electricity is amongst the highest in the world. There is another issue here, and it's particularly the case with industry, what I could call the missing middle. There are about 600 companies in India that have a turnover in excess of $500 million. And then the rest of the industry is actually falls in the sort of $0 to $50 million range. But there are very, very few companies in India that are within the range of 50 to 500. And that's the big issue. We need to actually not only make our small scale industry more efficient, but we need to provide them with the support to grow, to scale up. And that is a big challenge. There is an issue of unemployment. There's a mismatch between the demand for labor and the skill levels. And unless that gap is bridged, unless the gap between jobs and skills is bridged, unemployment and underemployment levels are going to remain high. And that in turn is going to, of course, lead to social issues. We are a digitized economy, a digital economy, to the extent that 500 million odd people have access to internet. But the adoption of internet is very uneven. And what COVID has established very clearly is that the digital transformation has simply widened the gap between the various Indias. This gap is something that has to be bridged, else again we face a social consequence. Questions are being asked.
Vikram, sorry. Yeah, on that note, just in the interest of time, and thank you very much indeed, I think we ought to bring Richard in, who's been waiting, and then perhaps after that, unless Martin has a question to ask before, come back to Q&A, because we've got a number of questions now building up. But thank you very much for that. That was extremely interesting and a very, very helpful overview. Martin, are you okay for us now to switch to Richard, if he's ready?
Please, Richard, it would be a pleasure to hear from you if we could.
Thank you, Richard.
Vikram is an expert in this. I think there are a number of points that I would stress, if I may. The first is the one about reforms. That what Modi's been doing, structural reforms, have been extraordinarily important. The other thing, which I also feel is worth stressing, is the impact of competitive federalism. It is, I think, not understood. The competition between states in relation to attracting investment is something that stimulates very hard. The other point I would make is ease of doing business. Clearly, India has been extraordinarily successful in improving and doing away with a lot of the hurdles in relation to doing business in India, not just as far as foreign companies going into India are concerned, but also Indian companies in India. GST, okay, there have been a few issues around it, but nonetheless, it has had a profound impact. And the kind of, if you like, the eradication or the digitization of regulation and improvements, I think has made a very significant impact. And on that point, again, Vikram makes two absolute fundamental points. Is education, skilling and upskilling is something that any form of liberalization and change, it has to go hand in hand with that. And the final point that I'd make on his is the digital element. As you know, Roddy, I was on a call about an hour ago launching our Sustainable Development Goals report with the United Nations. And one of the questions that or statement I came up there is that in a post-COVID environment, if we are going to narrow the disparity within society, and this isn't an Indian problem per se, it's one that is more general, is that the focus on digital access and digital delivery is going to be crucial going forward. So I'm, one of the people actually who was on our event an hour ago, which you pulled me off, and I'm grateful for, was Amitabh Kant. And he made the point there that India still has been one of the few emerging economies in the past year that has had a positive FDI flow into which in a way underpins to a certain extent the kind of favorable view that foreign investors have in the Indian economy and the potential for India to recover. And if I might twist the question slightly and look at it from a UK-India perspective, is that we have continued to see investment from UK companies going into India, very substantial presence. And we have also seen flows of investment coming from India into the UK during this pandemic period. And the reason why that is because there has been a commonality of interests and if you like, a linkage around innovation. And I'm not talking purely about the pharma issue, although that is an immense achievement, Serum Institute, AstraZeneca. But it also extends into other areas in relation to supply chain, or into hydrogen technology, or into electric future mobility, or into agricultural technology, where areas of collaboration are occurring on a business-to-business basis in a way that we have not seen previously.
And so in terms, therefore, of what Richard, the Prime Minister and his team will be walking into, and what they will be hoping to achieve during this first meeting. It was the first trip by him to a major overseas market since Brexit, I think I'm correct. And it precedes India's meeting with members of the European Union, which I think is in Portugal in May, if that is correct. What is on the Prime Minister's list of what he'd like to come away with?
Well, first point, our Prime Minister espouses great affection towards India. And I can recall going around India with him when he was Lord Mayor of London. And certainly he has a knowledge and as said, insights into India, which maybe many of his predecessors did not have. That having been said, what we have seen in the UK is a very significant increase in collaboration between our two nations. And yes, go back to this AstraZeneca point, but what people don't realize is the collaboration that occurred in terms of repatriation of students and people who were left stranded in each other's countries. And we're talking tens of thousands of people who were moved backwards and forwards through collaboration between the two governments. Now, we also have seen a significant number of ministers, either virtually or physically, traveling to each other's countries. So the Prime Minister's visit coming up in the next couple of months is the culmination of a dialogue that has been ongoing, I think, for a 12-month period. Piyush Goyal and Liz Truss, the Minister of Commerce, and obviously our Secretary of State for DIT, have been having very regular dialogues around formulating what is called an enhanced trade partnership, which looks at improving non-tariff barriers in, if you like, low-hanging fruit, which will then feed in over time into a free trade agreement. And there is a lot of optimism that a free trade agreement can be achieved in some form within a 12, 18-month period. which is remarkable, bearing in mind the EU have taken 8 years or 9 years not to achieve a free trade agreement with India. So, there is a lot of positivity around that. Clearly, I think the Prime Minister is wanting to put some meat on the bones of the existing dialogue. He's wanting to strengthen the relationships that we have with India around key areas such as technology, digital, innovation. And I think that he will be wanting to come away with a roadmap of a progress in taking the dialogue forward, because after all, as you rightly say, you have the G7, G20 coming up. You then have COP26 in November. These are all areas where I think India is going to be absolutely front and center in their involvement.
Richard, thank you very much indeed for those comments. I'm now going to ask Martin if he could take over and deal with some of his questions and questions from others who've been listening, but I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you very much, Richard. And actually, you just answered a very nice question from Anastasia in the audience. So I hope, Anastasia, what Richard said was appropriate to your question. But could I come back to Vikram? Vikram, you made some quite wide-ranging comments and some quite interesting ones about the social situation in India, which I think has prompted several people in the audience to ask questions. If I could just bring quite a wide-ranging question in from Nandini. So it's 3 parts, so I apologize for this, it may take a while. Perhaps we'll do it piece by piece. You mentioned the situation of women in India, and obviously that's a great concern for some years, especially with levels of violence in some circumstances. So the first part of the question from Nandini is, what policies will the current government take to improve the economic conditions of the poor and women in general? And obviously you're not speaking on behalf of the government, but what do you see as the most appropriate set of policy measures going forward for the improvement of women economically in India, and in terms of safety as well? We know about some of the safety issues of women traveling to work. When I work for McKinsey, the McKinsey offices in Mumbai and Delhi, the Delhi office is a bit out of town, drive all women to work, and that was mandatory. They can't travel to work on their own. So it's an important issue for the economy as well. Could you say a little bit about how you see that improving in the future?
Yes, I think that's a big issue, big concern. The fact is that COVID has hit the women population workers far more severely than the male population. Women that were working and then lost their jobs have gone home, and basically they're not returning. They've just remained at home. And there are many reasons for it, but one of them is that the one that you've just alluded. There is the transport sector has sort of broken down, and so earlier they were able to travel to their work of employment, but no longer so. So what is the government doing? Look, the one thing that I should say is that the government has acknowledged that these social issues need to be tackled aggressively. So there has been a fairly substantive shift in expenditure towards addressing rural poverty, and within that, issues related to education, health, and access to clean food, clean energy, access to water, sanitation. So if you combine all of these measures and add on top of that the additional funds that have been allocated to what's called Manrega, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, you have to say that there is at least a recognition, I say that, okay, that we need to address the issue of poverty, social dislocation, and within that, we need to have a particular focus on women. So, so in each of these, as I say, policies that have been identified, there is a particular emphasis on women. Now, I go back to my point. The intent is there, the money has been allocated. The big challenge is to ensure that the money is spent, and of course, spent wisely and productively. I'm not going to comment on that because that's the challenge that government faces. So Anandani's question is a huge question, and I don't want to, just sort of push it under the cup and say, yeah, government is doing a great job. All I want to say is that from where I sit, I believe there's recognition of the problem, and then the money has been assigned and allocated to address this problem.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we won't go to the other parts of Nandini's question for now because it's quite broad ranging, but I'd like to give Richard a bit more time to say something about the relationship between India and the UK as well, because obviously that is generating more interest, especially at the moment. So Richard, could I just ask you about Indian companies and their investment in the UK? And that might be more of a troubled area, perhaps. Obviously, one of the highest profile examples is Tata through Jaguar Land Rover. But that enterprise itself is not as successful as it could be, perhaps because of the changes in the industry itself, with fast development of electric cars, and battery power and capacity increasing quickly, which is clearly transforming the car manufacturing industry. But how do you see the value for Indian companies investing in the UK in light of the pandemic, for example, in light of the refreshed relationship between UK and India, and in light of the experiences of companies like Tata?
Yeah, I think going on, Tata's obviously has had very significant investments. Some of those are highly cyclical, and hence, Tata Steel has been through issues. But there are other parts of the Tata organization that have prospered hugely, TCS as well as others. I think if you're wanting to draw lessons from investment, it really, going back to my point, it's all about innovation and upstream technology. The OneWeb joint venture that was announced as between the UK government and Bharti Enterprises, where both entities have invested very significantly and will invest very significantly in low-level satellite technology. That is tremendously meaningful. And they put, I think, about $1 billion in so far. They're probably going to be putting another $3 billion into the company going forward. You look at, for instance, the engineering cluster that is focusing on battery technology around the Warwick engineering manufacturing. And there you have Norton Motorcycle, you have Triumph, you have BSA, you have Royal Enfield. All of these are iconic, used to be iconic, if you like, UK brands that are now owned by Indian companies, either directly or indirectly. And that technology is being taken back into India to be improving the quality of process and product in India. And you can go into pharma manufacturing, the work that Wockard is doing in Cardiff. There are a whole range of Indian companies that are exploiting the nexus that the UK has developed between research and corporate, and taking that technology back into an Indian context, maybe for consumption within the economy in India, or more likely for outward export from India to developing nations in the area. So it is quite a vibrant corridor that we're looking at this present moment.
Thank you very much. I think that's it's going to be reported a lot more widely in the coming several weeks, obviously with Prime Minister's visit and speculation about what the relationship could entail. Could I switch back to Vikram and go back to the financial sector, and perhaps Richard might comment on that in due course as well. So we have a question from Stuart Langdon, who's actually a board member of Asia Scotland Institute also. And Stuart's question is, could we try to understand more about the potential stress in the financial system, which was bad enough before the pandemic or pre-crisis? Is there an even more serious reckoning ahead for the banking sector? Perhaps could I just give some context to that as well? So I think, Vikram, in 2020, the Indian economy experienced what I read was its first ever technical recession, obviously due to the impact of the pandemic. I'm not sure which country didn't have a recession in 2020, actually. That would be an easier question to ask at the moment. And there's a huge financial stimulus program from the Indian government. The Reserve Bank of India is trying to enhance liquidity in the economy. And interestingly, I also read that during 2020, the 177 billionaires in India have grown by 40. So during the recession, there have been 40 new billionaires in India. Now, obviously, those things don't equate, but there are some interesting data on the economy. So could you talk about Stuart's question, the stress on the financial system through the pandemic? Is this going to trouble the recovery after the pandemic?
This is a problem that has not been resolved, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. But it's a problem that has now, for the first time, I think, in years, started to be addressed in a very tangible way. We are seeing announcements that, if again implemented, will lead to the progressive privatization of the financial sector. So, as I said, we have 2 banks, public sector banks, are slated for privatization. The government has set up the asset reconstruction company to see if they can, reinvigorate, revitalize companies that are insolvent. The government has, allowed public sector banks to issue credit lines, open credit lines to the small and medium scale industry. So, and then there is all this talk that hasn't actually been implemented about building or creating a bad bank, a bank that will take over the non-performing assets of all companies, put it into one bank, and allow the other banks then to, allow the banks then to actually, resume lending. Now, the big question is, first, as I say, will it be implemented? And the second is, will there be round tripping in that these banks are owed a lot of money? They're being capitalized, and the question is, will they actually issue lines of credit to companies that will then use that to pay back old loans rather than to actually stimulate new production or stimulate new investment? But Richard's question, Stephen's question is one that, I can't give a definitive answer. What I can say is that last year has brought the financial sector front and center onto the government's agenda. It was there, but it's made it very clear. And your larger point that you made in, about the sort of K-shaped recovery, that at one level you have these super companies that have really seen a surge in their market capitalization. Big companies in manufacturing, capital goods, and also the IT companies. Reliance Industry, I think, was $80 billion before the COVID. I think it's now larger than Shell. It's $150 to $190 billion market cap, in just 1 year. So there is this issue of divergence that's taking place, in that some people have done really well, but there is a wide swathe of our society and our economy that is struggling. And those are the people that I talked about earlier, the small, medium scale enterprises, the service sector, tourism, hotels, restaurants. They have a long way to go before they can recover. And those are the companies that are highly leveraged as well. So the banks are not going to see a return on their capital that quickly.
Richard, without asking you to use your Rothschild experience to also comment on that question, perhaps we can go back to the foreign relations issues, because or aspects of the foreign relations questions, and because we have several questions relating to the wider engagement or the wider implications of UK engagement with India. As usual, we have a question in that regard relating to China, which is always the elephant in the room, which whatever country we discuss. And Gautam was asked, how do you see the health or otherwise of the India-China relationship, specifically through the lens of what this might mean politically and economically for the UK? And William, who's also a frequent attendee at these events, has asked, what are the possibilities of India encouraging the UK to become a member of the Quad? So again, you don't speak for government, but how do you see the geopolitical situation in Asia affecting how the UK and India relationship develops in regard to both of those questions?
I think that what we're seeing at the moment is a kind of shifting of the tectonic plates, if I can use that allusion. I think that the initial moves or statements that have come out of Washington since the election of President Biden indicates that the United States is going to take, I think, a more prominent leadership role than they had previously under the previous administration. The impact of that on, I think, India-China relations, and then we can move on to the UK side. I think that there will always be a dynamic between between India and China. The investment of China into Chinese industry into India is significant and is important, and vice versa as well. But there will always remain, I think, a certain degree of friction that occurs on a geopolitical level, and that's something that I think one will have to manage the way through that. How does it affect the UK? My view is that we're going to see a strengthening of multilateral relations around India, with the involvement of countries such as America, such as the UK, etc., in order to create a stronger, if like, grouping than has been there previously. And certainly the focus that my organization is seeing around defense, etc., is, I think, symptomatic of a move in that direction. So I'm not foreseeing significant changes other than different groupings forming, which will hopefully stabilize a situation which could become difficult.
Thank you very much, Richard. Very diplomatically put as well, if I could say so. Roddy, on that note, could I hand back to you, please?
Yes, Martin, thank you very much. We have used up our allotted hour, and I'm very, very conscious of the time that our panelists have given up to be with us today. I'm grateful for that. I think we, the listeners and participants, come away from this 1 hour session with no doubt very, very much better informed than when we went into it, certainly speaking for myself. I think that, Vikram, your overview of the different trends and factors affecting the India of the 21st century has been fascinating and hugely helpful. And in a very, very useful way, Richard's perspective from the UK-India Business Council has also been fascinating. And I know that whilst we haven't been able to answer the very many questions that have been raised by participants, there will be a chance to let people know about those in the future. And we will, of course, be sharing this recording on YouTube. Our speakers have been given the chance to approve it. So to everybody involved with this event, to Martin, Andrew for making it possible, to Vikram for your kind involvement and your continued help to us as a member of our International Advisory Council, and Richard for winning the prize of being the man who at the last moment stepped away to join us. And I hope that you have actually enjoyed the experience as well. So to all of you and to everybody on the call, thank you very much indeed.